The palace did not tremble because a document was found. It trembled because the document named Princess Anne as the one person Queen Elizabeth trusted to protect her final wishes. In a private executors meeting, a sealed codicil surfaced, and within minutes, Camilla's assumed influence over a sensitive royal decision was stripped away. Anne did not raise her voice. She simply read the page, looked up, and changed everything. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Silence took control before anyone dared breathe too loudly. Charles sat at the end of the private palace office, his hand resting near the edge of the table, as if one small movement might break the fragile order around him. Anne held the page with both hands, and the weight of her mother's trust seemed to settle across her shoulders. The Queen had not left confusion behind. She had left a command. A codicil, meaning a written addition to an existing will or legal instruction, had been sealed with the estate papers and kept from ordinary palace discussion until the executors opened it in front of the king, Anne, 2 legal advisors, and the senior officials tasked with protecting Elizabeth's final instructions. Anne read slowly because every word mattered. The document named her as the final authority over a protected royal household matter, a private area of royal decision-making, tied to Elizabeth's legacy and handled away from public ceremony. That mattered because royal households survive on trust as much as rank. And this instruction made one brutal truth clear. Camilla's place beside Charles did not give her the right to shape this decision. The Queen Consort had expected influence through proximity, through marriage, through the quiet power that comes from being beside the monarch. But Elizabeth's handwriting cut through every assumption. One executor placed the codicil beside the older estate papers and confirmed, in a measured voice, that the amendment overrode custom. Charles did not speak. He only looked from the page to his sister, and the pain in his silence told Anne that he understood the humiliation waiting beyond that door. The room changed when the clause was read again. Camilla was to have no consultative role, not reduced influence, not delayed involvement, no role. Anne's expression tightened, not with victory, but with grief, because she understood what her mother had feared enough to write down. Charles felt the same fear from the other side, because the king now had to choose between defending his wife's dignity and obeying his mother's final will. Then Anne closed the folder, placed her hand over it, and asked the question no one wanted to answer. Had Camilla already been told? The senior executor hesitated, and that pause made the truth feel even sharper. But before Camilla could understand what had been taken from her, the palace had to face the one person Elizabeth had chosen to stand in her place. Princess Anne had never needed grand speeches to command a room. Her power came from silence, discipline, and the kind of loyalty that never asked to be rewarded. To Queen Elizabeth, Anne was not just a daughter. She was the one royal who understood duty without performance. And when the codicil placed her above palace preference, everyone suddenly understood why the Queen had chosen her. Anne stood with the same stillness that had defined her life inside the monarchy. But now that stillness carried a different kind of force. She had never chased approval, never shaped herself around applause, never treated duty as a performance for the room. That was why Elizabeth had trusted her. The Queen knew that when pressure came, her daughter would not bend simply because the palace wanted peace. A codicil, the written addition to a will or final instruction, had now become more than paper. It had become a test of who truly understood the difference between rank and responsibility. And Anne, holding that burden with quiet control, remembered the private promise she had once made to her mother. She would protect the monarchy from sentiment, pressure, and convenience, even if that protection wounded the people closest to the throne. Camilla felt the blow before the full truth reached her. A senior aide came to her privately, careful with every word, and explained that the executors had confirmed a restriction written in Elizabeth's own hand. The Queen Consort stiffened, not because she failed to understand palace language, but because she understood it too well. This was not a missed invitation, not a temporary adjustment, not a ceremonial slight that could be corrected later. This was a direct limit on authority. She had believed her place beside Charles gave her a voice in sensitive household matters, especially those tied to private royal decisions. Yet the amendment told a different story. It said that Elizabeth had drawn a boundary, and that boundary ran straight through Camilla's expectations. Charles discovered the timing next, and it struck him harder than the wording itself. The king learned that the Codicil had been signed later than anyone assumed, after Elizabeth had watched the palace change around her, and after tensions had begun to sharpen behind closed doors. That mattered because it proved the decision had not come from old suspicion or distant habit. The monarch had seen enough, thought carefully, and acted deliberately. A legal advisor confirmed the language was precise, binding, and impossible to dismiss as symbolic. Charles lowered his gaze, knowing the document did not shout, yet still left no room for argument. Anne prepared for the confrontation without triumph. Charles asked for a delay, hoping time might soften the impact, but she refused, because delay would only turn truth into management. Elizabeth had not chosen her to negotiate discomfort. She had chosen her to carry the line exactly as written. And the reason Anne refused to soften it was hidden in a moment from Elizabeth's final years that the palace had tried to forget. The Codicil did not appear out of nowhere. It was born from one sharp, unforgettable moment. A private Windsor memorial rehearsal, where Camilla reached for a role Elizabeth had quietly reserved for Anne. The gesture seemed small to those watching from the doorway, but Elizabeth saw something deeper. She saw ambition crossing into inheritance. And from that day, the Queen began writing her protection into law. Anne remembered the rehearsal, with a pain she had never allowed herself to name. It was meant to be a family-only arrangement, quiet and controlled. The kind of private preparation, where every place carried meaning, because every person represented memory, service, and blood. A Windsor memorial rehearsal was a private practice for a royal remembrance ceremony, where family members were assigned positions before the actual event. Elizabeth had reserved one role for her daughter, not as decoration, but as a sign of trust. That mattered because royal placement was never only about where someone stood. It showed who was being recognized, who was being protected, and who was being allowed close to the heart of the Queen's legacy. Camilla stepped forward that day with confidence, believing she was moving naturally into the shape of the future. She did not see the wound forming in the silence around her. Charles saw the movement, but he underestimated it, treating it as a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over later. Anne did not protest. She did not make a scene. She simply stepped back, and that restraint made the moment more painful, not less. Elizabeth watched from nearby, and the monarch understood what others refused to admit. Her daughter had been displaced in a room where loyalty should have mattered more than title, and Camilla's certainty had crossed a line that no apology could fully erase. Elizabeth acted that evening because she knew silence could become permission. She summoned her private secretary, the senior official trusted to manage confidential royal instructions, and asked for a sealed amendment to be prepared. A sealed amendment meant a private written change kept closed until the proper legal moment, and this one was designed to protect Anne's authority in matters tied to the Queen's final wishes. The decision was not born from anger. That made it even stronger. Elizabeth was not striking back. She was guarding against a future where family hierarchy might be used to erase emotional loyalty, where the person beside the king could quietly outweigh the daughter who had served without asking for anything. Anne understood the truth only years later, when the Codicil was opened and the old rehearsal returned like a hidden bell ringing through the palace. Her mother had not forgotten the insult. She had not ignored the wound. She had answered it with law, with precision, with a final boundary no one could dress up as palace preference. And now that answer was about to be delivered not through whispers or paperwork, but in a confrontation no one inside the palace could stop. Camilla entered the private drawing room expecting explanation. What she found was judgment. Anne stood beside the small table with the codicil already opened, while Charles remained near the fireplace, pale and silent. No courtiers stepped between them. No aides softened the blow. For the first time, Camilla was not facing palace gossip, public pressure, or old resentment. She was facing Elizabeth's written command. Camilla stopped before anyone spoke, because the silence had already told her enough. Anne did not move toward her, and Charles did not move at all. That stillness mattered, because this was not a public argument that could be buried beneath ceremony. It was a private reckoning, and every person in that room understood that privacy made the blow sharper. A codicil, a written addition to a will or final instruction, had been confirmed by the executors, the people responsible for carrying out Elizabeth's legal wishes after her death. Anne explained it plainly. The document placed her in authority over a protected household decision, and the queen consort would not be included in the matter it governed. Camilla gripped the back of a chair, not dramatically, not loudly, but with enough force to reveal what her voice tried to hide. She asked Charles whether he knew this would happen, and the king's silence hurt more than any answer could have. He loved his wife, but he could not defend her without appearing to challenge his mother. He could not dismiss the document without shaking the very idea of royal duty. That was why the moment mattered so deeply. Elizabeth had not left a preference. She had left an instruction. And Charles, now wearing the crown his mother had carried for decades, was trapped between the woman beside him and the monarch who had shaped him. Anne lifted the page and read one line aloud. The words were calm, exact, and merciless in their clarity. Elizabeth's decision was not temporary. It was not optional. It was not open to palace negotiation. Camilla's face changed as she realized Anne was not standing there as a jealous sister or a rival guarding old wounds. She was standing there as the living executor of a maternal warning, the one person chosen to carry a boundary Elizabeth had no longer trusted others to protect. The queen consort had expected resistance, perhaps even coldness, but this was worse. This was legitimacy. This was the late monarch speaking through the daughter who had never needed power to command respect. Camilla finally asked, who gave Anne the right to deliver such a decision? Charles looked away, as if he already knew the answer would break whatever remained of peace in the room. Anne did not raise her voice. She did not explain again. She simply held the codicil, looked at the woman before her, and answered with two words, the queen. But the confrontation was only the visible wound, because behind Anne's quiet authority stood a legal structure stronger than emotion. The palace had survived scandals, marriages, betrayals, and grief, but it had never feared anything more than a sentence written with absolute clarity. Elizabeth's codicil carried no fury, no accusation, and no public drama. That was what made it dangerous. It was calm. It was deliberate. And when the executors explained its force, Charles understood that even a king could not easily step around his mother's final will. Charles listened as the room closed around him in a silence heavier than anger. He had faced public storms before, but this was different because it came from inside the family, written by the one person whose authority still seemed to outlive death itself. The executors did not speak like palace advisors trying to manage feelings. They spoke like guardians of a command. A protected royal household matter meant a private area of access, legacy, and ceremony that was kept under strict control because it touched the late queen's personal wishes. That mattered because Elizabeth had not simply chosen who would attend a meeting. She had chosen who could guard a part of her memory. Anne sat across from the legal advisors, with her hands still, but nothing about her felt untouched. She had become the human center of a decision she had never asked for, and that burden cut deeper than any victory could. The codicil had placed her above palace preference, above easy compromise, and above the quiet pressure that often followed Charles wherever Camilla was concerned. A codicil, a written addition to a final legal instruction, now carried the force of Elizabeth's last boundary. The king understood the humiliation hidden inside that truth. His mother had seen conflict coming inside his own household, and instead of trusting love to settle it, she had trusted Anne to contain it. Anne felt no satisfaction when the executors confirmed the next clause. Elizabeth had included a verification requirement, meaning no future change could be made without Anne's written consent. The words landed softly, but their power was brutal. Camilla could not be eased back in by private request. Charles could not quietly adjust the decision for comfort. Even palace custom could not blur the line. Anne looked down at the page and felt sadness rise, because her mother had clearly feared that emotion, marriage, and rank might one day press against duty. The queen had protected dignity with law, because she no longer trusted dignity to protect itself. Charles shifted when a second sealed note was presented. It stated that the instruction was meant to preserve dignity, not punish Camilla. That single line carried mercy, but it also carried finality. Elizabeth had not written from spite, she had written from judgment. Anne absorbed that truth, then asked for the implementation notice to be prepared immediately. She knew what would happen next. Once the notice moved through the palace, schedules would change, access would narrow, and no one would be able to pretend the wound was only private. And once that notice moved through the palace, the private shock became a public change in power. The fallout began with something almost painfully simple. A chair was removed from a scheduled private council meeting. No speech announced it, no press statement explained it. But when Camilla's place card disappeared from the table, everyone understood what had happened. The codicil had moved from paper into practice, and the palace could no longer pretend this was only a family disagreement. Camilla saw the revised list before anyone explained it to her, and that made the wound feel colder. Her name was gone from a private meeting connected to Elizabeth's protected instruction, and the empty space where it should have been said more than any official sentence. A private council meeting, in plain terms, was a closed gathering where trusted royal figures and advisors handled sensitive household decisions away from public attention. That mattered because these rooms shaped access, tradition, and influence. To lose a place there was not simply to miss a conversation. It was to be pushed outside the circle where power quietly moved. Palace staff moved quickly after Anne's authority was confirmed. Access papers were revised. Meeting schedules were adjusted. Ceremonial notes were corrected line by line, each change carrying the same message. Elizabeth's instruction now governed the room. Camilla sat alone for several seconds after reading the update, and her face tightened as the reality became physical. This was no longer language inside a document. It was a missing chair. It was a removed name. It was the painful proof that rank could be limited by a dead monarch's final will. The queen consort had survived criticism before, but this struck differently because it did not come from the public. It came from Elizabeth herself. Charles received the same schedule shortly afterward, and the king closed his eyes when he reached the amended section. His silence in the drawing room had now become policy, and that realization cut through him with brutal clarity. He had not stopped Anne. He had not defended Camilla. He had allowed the codicil to stand, and now the palace was acting on that surrender. An implementation notice, meaning a formal instruction telling staff how to apply a confirmed decision, was placed before Anne for signature. She signed with a steady hand, but paused before setting the pen down. Duty had given her authority, but grief made every stroke feel heavy. Anne then learned that the codicil contained more than exclusion. A palace aide discovered a further instruction requiring her to protect a specific ceremonial tradition from alteration, a tradition Elizabeth believed carried emotional meaning beyond rank. That discovery mattered because it revealed the queen had not only blocked Camilla from one decision, she had entrusted Anne with guarding the spirit behind it. William was quietly informed, and the prince's reaction was not surprise, but recognition. He understood, perhaps before anyone else, why Elizabeth had chosen the daughter who never asked for power. But the true shift did not happen in the meeting room. It happened when William and Anne spoke alone. Away from advisors, signatures, and palace machinery, Anne finally allowed the weight to show. William found her in a private sitting room, the codicil resting unopened between them. There was no performance in that room, no crown language, no official mask. Just a daughter carrying her mother's last instruction, and a future king realizing that duty sometimes arrives disguised as heartbreak. Anne did not look powerful in that moment. She looked tired. The authority that had stunned the palace now sat beside her like a burden no one else could understand. And William understood enough to say nothing at first. He knew this was not simply about Camilla being pushed away from one decision. It was about Elizabeth drawing a moral boundary inside the family before grief, rank, marriage, or pressure could blur it. A codicil, meaning a written addition to a will or final instruction, had already been explained by lawyers. But in that quiet room, it became something deeper. It became a mother's fear, a daughter's duty, and a warning to the next generation. William sat across from Anne and watched her steady herself, not as a prince judging an elder, but as a future king learning what real protection costs. The prince knew why the matter carried such weight. If Elizabeth's final wishes could be softened for comfort, then every royal boundary could one day be treated as negotiable. If Camilla's pain alone could undo the queen's instruction, then loyalty would become weaker than influence. Anne admitted the truth she had hidden from everyone else. She felt no victory. She felt grief. The Codicil proved that her mother had feared her wishes might be challenged after death, and that fear hurt more than any palace insult ever had. William chose his words carefully, because he knew Anne did not need praise. She needed understanding. He told her that protecting Elizabeth's final instruction was not cruelty. It was loyalty carried to its hardest conclusion. The words settled between them with quiet force, because Anne had been accused in silence of being cold, rigid, and unforgiving. Yet the prince saw something different. He saw a woman refusing to let emotion rewrite duty. He saw a daughter honoring the queen exactly because it cost her peace. Then Anne revealed what Elizabeth had once told her in a private documented family account, preserved by a trusted secretary. Some things must be guarded by those who do not want power. William heard the line and understood why the monarch had chosen Anne. Power had never tempted her, and that made her the safest person to hold it. The prince decided then that he would support Anne openly, making it clear that the next generation would not reverse Elizabeth's boundary simply to make the present more comfortable. His choice changed the balance inside the palace. Camilla could feel excluded. Charles could feel torn. But William's backing meant the Codicil would stand not as an old wound, but as a future principle. Their private agreement prepared the palace for the moment the outside world finally noticed the queen consort had been sidelined. And when the world noticed, the story no longer belonged only to the palace walls. By morning, the private wound had become a national spectacle. One newspaper front page showed a stark image of Buckingham Palace under gray skies with the headline, "Elizabeth's Final Word, Anne Takes Control." Outside the gates, a quiet crowd gathered, not shouting, not cheering, but staring, as if history had shifted overnight. For Camilla, the silence outside was worse than outrage. Camilla watched the coverage alone, and each sentence seemed to strip another layer of comfort from the room around her. She had expected palace tension. She had expected whispers, perhaps even cold looks, from those who had always measured her place beside Charles. But this was different. A private decision had become public meaning. The Codicil, a written addition to Elizabeth's final wishes, was now being described by broadcasters as the late Queen's final act of control. That mattered because the story no longer sounded like a dispute between women. It sounded like a monarch reaching beyond death to decide who could be trusted with her legacy. Anne heard the same headlines and refused to treat them as victory. An aide told her the public was calling her Elizabeth's shield, the daughter who stood between the queen's memory and palace pressure. Anne did not smile. She stood quietly, absorbing the phrase as if it carried both honor and punishment. She knew why the reaction mattered. The monarchy survives not only through crowns and ceremonies, but through belief, and the public had begun to believe Elizabeth's Codicil was not an act of exclusion. It was an act of protection. That belief strengthened Anne's position, but it also made Camilla's humiliation impossible to hide. Broadcasters repeated the key clause again and again. Anne had been given direct authority, not symbolic influence. A symbolic role would have meant appearance without control, a title that looked important but changed nothing. Direct authority meant the opposite. It meant Anne's written consent mattered. It meant Charles could not quietly reverse the instruction. It meant Camilla could not be eased back into the protected matter through sympathy or status. The queen consort turned the sound down when one commentator called the decision Elizabeth's last judgment on palace trust. She did not need to hear more. The words had already entered the national bloodstream. Charles felt the danger grow with every headline. The king understood that if he stayed silent too long, the wound would harden into bitterness, and bitterness inside a royal house could last for generations. He did not need to challenge Elizabeth, and he could not abandon Camilla to public shame. So he prepared one final private response, not to undo the Codicil, but to accept it with dignity, before resentment poisoned what remained. Anne had carried the instruction. Camilla had lost the place she believed was hers. And closure could only come when Charles finally accepted what Elizabeth had written, what Anne had carried, and what Camilla had lost. In the end, the Codicil did not destroy the palace. It revealed it. It showed who Elizabeth trusted, who she feared might be overruled, and who would have to live with the limits she left behind. Anne did not seize power. Camilla did not simply lose status. Charles did not merely face embarrassment. Each of them was forced to confront the one truth the Queen had written before anyone else dared say it. Charles placed the Codicil back into its folder with a care that felt almost like surrender. He had spent days trying to balance love, duty, grief, and pride, but the final verdict no longer belonged to him. A codicil, meaning a written addition to a will or final instruction, had become the emotional boundary Elizabeth left behind for the monarchy. That mattered because it proved the Queen had not trusted custom alone to protect her wishes. She had written the boundary clearly, knowing that after her death, silence could be twisted, pressure could be dressed as loyalty, and personal comfort could be mistaken for royal right. Anne accepted that boundary without celebration. She had not stepped forward because she wanted control. She had stepped forward because her mother had asked her, through law and memory, to carry a final instruction exactly as written. The princess understood why the moment would follow her for the rest of her life. It showed the world that duty could look harsh when it refused to bend, and that loyalty could wound the living in order to protect the dead. Elizabeth had chosen restraint over sentiment, protection over convenience, and Anne over palace compromise. That was the revelation hidden beneath every headline. Camilla remained wounded, but she was not erased. The Queen Consort had been forced to understand that proximity to the throne did not grant ownership of Elizabeth's legacy. Charles understood it too, and that made his acceptance painful but necessary. He could love Camilla and still obey his mother. He could feel humiliated and still honor the document. William's support made the meaning even clearer, because the prince's decision confirmed that the next reign would remember this moment as a warning. Rank could open doors. Trust decided who stayed inside. The palace finally stopped searching for a softer version of the truth. Anne had stunned everyone because she became the voice of Elizabeth's final boundary, not because she defeated Camilla, and not because she challenged Charles. She carried what the Queen had already decided. Camilla was sidelined because the monarch had drawn the line before anyone else dared speak it. Charles accepted that line. William protected it, and Anne fulfilled it. And with that, the palace was left with no mystery, no loophole, and no escape from Elizabeth's final word. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.